Where I live, who I live with, what job I do or don't do, my age, how connected I was, have all been exasperated by the pandemic and the policies and practices applied. And in some ways, like Camilla talked about, there has been some good. The unprecedented vaccine rollouts, neighbours we might now know but didn't before, appreciation maybe of outdoor space and people that we might have taken for granted. But there's also been a more questionable and ugly side, which has been exasperated by policy that's been rushed, or in the case of some populist government policy, made for headline effect rather than good practice. It's kind of reactive rather than actually having any long-term thinking. Now, don't get me wrong, it's very hard in a pandemic to balance competing asks. How do I sustain an economy? How do I protect a population? What do I do about migrants that don't have access to benefits? How do I help people that are already struggling for job loss? What do I do when there's a crisis going, a war, for instance, in the middle of that pandemic? It's very difficult, but there are things that can make it worse and there are things that can make it a lot better. Policy made in a vacuum, for example, without a roadmap, or as often my American friends may say, whack-a-mole policy, is often unsustainable. It's creating consequences and leaving others at all times paying the cost, a cost they can't afford. And a case in point could be issues around vaccine inequality. The questionable practice, for example, of not distributing vaccines and sharing patents. It's been argued, and I'd argue too, that to close the global vaccine divide, the UK has got to keep its promise, and other countries, on surplus vaccine donations. For example, in the West, 70% of adults have had the vaccine roughly, but only 9.8% of people in low-income countries have received their first jab. And in Africa, immunization in many countries is actually below 1%. The EU, UK, and USA received more vaccinations in the last week of 2021 than African countries, all of them combined, did all year. And COVAX, the pledge, has fallen short of its pledges by 1 billion doses, revising it down its forecast by 25%. Now, how can you fight a global pandemic if you don't even give people the tools to address it? There's a gap, a massive one, and sometimes it's about profit over life. Now, looking back, was it also the right way to ask people to always, in every situation, stay in and be locked out? Now, there were different approaches in multiple countries for good reasons about this, public health reasons. And I'm going to just look at that from a UK perspective particularly, but it was noticeable how isolating it was for those who lived particularly in rented and shared occupancy or accommodation, so multiple occupancy housing. They weren't able to actually bubble with anybody else, and often they had no outside space. They were shut off in tiny flats with people they might not know, like, or trust, and had very little understanding from government about the mental health impact, particularly on young people and lower income individuals. Now, society is not the nuclear family anymore that we used to know. So it might be time perhaps that we actually looked and thought a little differently about what it means when we're caring for people or asking them to make a massive sacrifice. What of loneliness? People like my grandmother, a widower, living alone, who for long periods had to stay inside, again for good reason. But we're thankful that she at least had a great neighbour. But pandemic policy, it simply highlighted, I think, the lack of understanding in society for those who didn't quite fit, and another Americanism, forgive me, a white picket fence model of life. It has to also fit the person that's not in that model. Now, it's unusual for me to quote a former Conservative Prime Minister, but Sir John Major today said the following: Parliament is an echo chamber. Lies can become accepted as fact, which has consequences for policy and reputation. He went on to say, if trust in the word of our leaders in Parliament is lost, then trust in government is lost too. A report by the Constitution Unit of the University College of London has told us that public trusts the courts more than the civil service, they trust the civil service more than Parliament, and Parliament more than the Prime Minister. Recently, a UK minister actually said fraud is not a crime that the British public care about. Announced, I suppose, because of the government wiping out the debt of fraudulent COVID PPE contracts that had been awarded. So what's the purpose of this? Well, it all undermines public policy and trust. Some people are seen to make a huge amount of money from pandemic practices and get away with it, while others suffer. And we're told that fraud is not a crime. So do we just accept that? Where is the morality anymore? It isn't questionable, though, to attempt to do the right thing and protect a population. However, it is questionable when those policies are not consistent or make little sense, or are seen not as a response to evidence, but to protect one's own career. Now, if forgive me, I'm going to use a little analogy here from what's just been going on recently in the UK. A case in point would be the recent decision here to end the requirement to isolate if you have COVID-19. Previously, if you tested positive, you had to stay in, I think it went from like 14 days to 10 days. Then if you had lap flow, you could get out about 7 days, then it was 5 days. And now they've just said, well, if you test positive, don't worry about it, you'll be fine. So most people would agree, though, if you're sick or you have an infectious disease, you should probably, for the good of yourself and others, where you can, stay home. So even if you have a tummy bug or a flu, it's probably best not to go into your workplace and just spread it, in a sense. However, the way this policy was announced came after a string of allegations and investigations into the UK Prime Minister and his office for multiply breaching lockdown protocols last year and the year before. So one rule for him and one rule for everybody else. But policy is not effective, though, if it just seems cynical. And there was a headline recently, it recently said, the UK is the first in the world to declare freedom. Freedom from what, I ask? And the timing of the announcement, another round of photos showing our Prime Minister allegedly breaching the rules. So it was deliciously cynical and absolutely populist. Now, if you forgive me for being a bit geeky, announcements like these, made with very little warning, mean confusion, for example, for employers who are saying, well, what about the access we have here to free testing? What about economic concerns for me as the employer and my employee? What about morality? What about, making sure I don't harm one another? What about sick pay and the cost of it? So the UK is one of the lowest rates of sick pay actually in Europe. And the New Statesman wrote an article that basically said that almost after 2 years after the COVID-19 pandemic began, the UK still pays roughly only 20% of the average wage of a person for up to 28 weeks. By contrast, Camilla will like me for saying this, Norway gives 100%, Italy roughly 50%. So only those earning at least £120 a week qualify for that legal minimum benefit. So it excluded 2 million low-paid workers in the UK, mostly women. And this is despite a survey among employers that found 62% supported a rise in UK sick pay during this time. And with furlough schemes ending and employers struggling and cost of living up and health services underfunded and overstretched, for me, it seemed a very cynical ploy to get a few headlines to disguise from a political problem and drama which may just make things worse in the long run and exasperate unsafe practices. And I also find it really difficult. So in the UK Parliament, there's something called Central Lobby. It's a very, very beautiful place in Parliament where anybody can go in, anybody at all from the public, and ask to meet with their representative and talk to them. So it's a very kind of nostalgic place, but it's also quite spiritual. At the center of this lobby is in Latin, a beautiful mosaic on the floor. And around that mosaic, it has the words, and just let me quote this, Psalm 127, it says, unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain. So where is the Lord in all of this? Where is the building? Have we kind of lost our history within some of our policy making? Has it become that drunken dialogue that Levy was talking about, or the lack of kind of understanding of community, or the problem of trust that Camilla was also talking about as well? To end, I watched a random film last night, and I won't tell you what it is, but I had a good line in it. And it said, reputation is what others think of you, and character is who you are. If the pandemic has shown us anything, It is that reputations can be crafted and made or eroded, whether that's a nation's reputation or an individual's reputation. We may each have a different opinion on what we think the reputation is in terms of how each nation or leader responded and is responding to this pandemic. And I know there's been some questions in the chat as well about what is truth and how we describe that. Character, though, I'd argue, is a much harder thing, and the Bible's got a lot to tell us about character that I'm not going to go into. But I wanted to end by asking some questions. Does policy reflect the character of the people who make it, or the reputation or the ideology? Have they done what is needed, balanced protection with economic and societal need? Has it looked at what's been exposed under the surface of this brutal pandemic? Can you ever forgive policy for whatever reason that didn't actually work in practice or had to be changed if the character of the leader was sound and if the character was upright enough to explain why and how these reasons are being made? But like John Major earlier today, I'd also argue if trust is not restored and lies are not corrected, then politics and policy remains broken, and it's in deep, deep need of restoration.